Okay, happy Tuesday, everyone. We're only a couple of days removed from World Population Day, so it's only fitting we have Lester Brown on today's edition of Greenbuilder Media's Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. Among other topics, he's very well versed on the topic of food supply relative to world population and water supply. Now, before we get started, I wanted to tell you that today's webinar would not be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. And those sponsors are Owens Corning. Build higher performance homes with Owens Corning, and Green Builder Coalition. The Green Builder Coalition offers in-depth research, discounted education classes, as well as national and state advocacy resources. The coalition is also the home of the Green Building Administrator, the industry's only software program that allows you to compare 3 national green building programs. For more information on our membership levels, please visit www.greenbuildercoalition.org and click on Member Benefits. I'm Mike Calignan, Executive Director of the Green Builder Coalition, and I'm sitting in for Ron Jones today, so I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Now, I hope that during the course of the presentation, you'll submit questions for our guest. To do so, simply use the small box at the bottom of the Q&A. I'll review those questions and pose them to Lester during the Q&A time set aside near the end of the webcast. Now, to introduce today's speaker. Lester R. Brown started his career as a tomato farmer. Then 30 years ago, Brown helped pioneer the concept of sustainable development when he was the founder and president of the World Watch Institute. He held that position for 26 years, but now he's the president of Earth Policy Institute, a nonprofit interdisciplinary research organization based in Washington, D.C. Brown founded the organization in May 2001 to provide a plan for achieving an environmentally sustainable economy. In addition to starting organizations, Brown has authored or co-authored over 50 books, published in more than 40 languages, and has been awarded 25 honorary degrees. His most recent book is Breaking New Ground, A Personal History. Brown is the recipient of many prizes and awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship, the 1987 United Nations Environment Prize, the 1989 Worldwide Fund for Nature Gold Medal, and the 1994 Blue Planet Prize for his, quote, exceptional contributions to solving global environmental problems. In 1986, the Library of Congress requested his papers for their archives. In 2012, he was inducted into the Earth Hall of Fame, Kyoto. And finally, Lester Brown is the first repeat guest on the Impact Series. Mr. Brown, welcome back to the Impact Series.
Thanks, Mike. I didn't realize we were setting a precedent today by having a guest on for the second time, but it's my pleasure. Um, the thesis of my comments today is that we are in transition. We, the world, are in transition from an age of food surpluses to one of scarcity. Throughout my working career that began in the Department of Agriculture in the late 50s, we had some decades of food surpluses. One of the big problems at the U.S. Department of Agriculture was that each year we had to sort of estimate how much grain the world would need the next year, and then we would adjust acreage, often paying farmers to hold out land up to 15% of their holdings in order for them to be eligible for support prices. That was the leverage we had for sort of balancing world supply and demand. But in the last few decades, the surpluses have sort of disappeared. No one is holding cropland out of production anymore. We need all we can get. We're seeing, for the first time, we're seeing rising food prices, and that's been the case since 2007. In fact, the World Food Price Index over the last dozen years or so has roughly doubled. So if it seems like food prices are higher now than they used to be, it's because they are. Not only are they higher, but they're likely to keep rising in the future for some of the reasons that I will note. And one of the consequences of tightening food supplies and rising prices is something that's unfolded just in the last few years, something I had never seen in the half century before in working on world food issues. And that is that in Some countries now, the low-income segment of those societies, plan foodless days. In Nigeria, for example, 27% of all families now plan foodless days. That is, they'll get together on Sunday night and say, well, we can't afford to eat every day this week, so we'll skip Wednesday and Saturday. They will be our foodless days this week. In India, 24% of families now plan foodless days. In Peru, 14%. I could go through a long list of developing countries, but the thing that's novel here is that there are a lot of families in the world today, hundreds of millions of them, that simply cannot afford to eat every day. We've moved into this new era just within the last decade. I think it was in 2007 that food supplies tightened world at the global level, and grain prices doubled. Two countries that are exporters um, were were politically very much concerned about rising food prices internally because food prices were rising throughout the world. So Russia and Argentina, both wheat exporters, restricted exports or even for a period banned exports altogether. And this, since they're leading wheat exporters, this created a panic in the world market. Up until then, importing countries had always assumed that they would have open access to grain supplies wherever they were produced. But suddenly two countries were saying, no, we're going to restrict exports in order to make sure we have enough food. And that created a degree of uncertainty and a panic that led to a number of things. One was the idea of land grabs. Suddenly importing countries, grain importing countries, began looking for land that they could buy or lease, preferably on long term, on which they could produce food for themselves. So this introduced a whole new geopolitics of food, and we saw country after country, mostly the grain importing countries, trying to buy or lease land in sub-Saharan Africa or in Brazil or other parts of Latin America. And it becomes sort of an every country for itself, um, a new sort of mentality in the world food economy. Um, there were many countries involved in land grabs. One of the biggest was China. It was leasing or buying land wherever it could find it, because China is a huge country and one that uh, can no longer feed itself. It has to import some of its grain, only a small percentage, but most of its soybeans are imported. Um, and soybeans loom large in China because the Chinese people are moving up the food chain and consuming more livestock products, livestock and poultry. And whenever farmers wherever in the world today who are producing cattle or pigs or poultry always include in the feed mix roughly 4 parts grain and 1 part soybean meal. And that soybean meal, with its high quality protein, increases the efficiency with which livestock and poultry convert grain into animal protein. So suddenly the soybean assumes an importance in the world that it did not have before. And one of the consequences of that, incidentally, is that in the Western Hemisphere, there is now more land in soybeans than either wheat or corn. So the soybean has become a sort of behind-the-scenes player because we don't eat that many soybeans directly. In fact, very few, but we consume a lot of soybeans in meat and milk and eggs. So when you open your refrigerator and you see the milk or the yogurt, the cheese, the hamburger, the pork chops, the eggs, all of these require soybean meal to produce. So soybean meal is embedded in most of the products in the refrigerator. So these land grabs led to very interesting situation, and in what I um, uh, um, said that 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 food was the new oil, land was the new gold, and we saw grain prices double there in a very short period. Now the question is, why are we having so many problems on the food front? Um, Technology is advancing. We know more about agriculture today than we ever did before. We know how to increase yields and have been very successful at doing that. In fact, almost all the growth in the world grain harvest from 1950 until today has come from raising yields. That is, the grain area has remained more or less constant throughout that period. But demand is growing faster than ever before. We have population growth. We're adding 80 million people a year. That's not new. We've been doing that for the last few decades now. That means that there will be 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. And that's a relentless sort of source of growth in demand for food. Population growth just keeps growing. We haven't figured out how to get the brakes on it yet. So we have population growth. The second thing we have is we are now using grain to fuel cars. In the United States, for example, we harvest about 400 million tons of grain per year. Of that, on average, about 130 million tons go to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. So it's not just food, it's also using grain for fuel. And that's done in some other countries as well, but the most of the conversion of grain into fuel for cars occurs in the United States. The third source of growing demand for grain after population growth and the use of grain for fuel is rising affluence. Um, the difference between someone on the low end of the global economic ladder and someone on the upper end is about fourfold in terms of grain consumption, direct and indirect. For example, if you live in India, which is a country on the low end of the global economic ladder, average grain consumption is about 400 pounds per person per year. That's a pound a day. When you only have 400 pounds per person per year, you have to consume almost that grain directly just to satisfy basic caloric needs. In the United States, by contrast, we consume roughly 1,600 pounds of grain per person per year. Now, of that, only maybe 150 pounds is consumed directly in the form of bread, pastries, and breakfast cereals. The great bulk of the 1,600 is consumed indirectly in the form of meat, milk, and eggs. When we put steers in a feedlot, for example, it takes about 7 pounds of grain for each pound of increase in live weight. For pork, it takes about 3 pounds of grain to get another pound of pig, if you will. With poultry, which is, chickens are the most efficient at converting grain into protein. It takes less than 2 pounds of grain per pound of live weight for chickens. So we have today at least 3 billion people in the world, including more than 1 billion of them in China, who are moving up the food chain. And this growth in demand from rising affluence is now roughly the same as that from population growth. So we have two important sources of growth in world demand for grain. China has been moving up the grain requirements ladder, if you will, or up the food chain at an extraordinary rate. 30 years ago, meat consumption in China was less than in the United States. Today, and this is total meat consumption in China is double that in the U.S., which means their per capita meat consumption is roughly half that in the United States. It is this appetite for meat, milk, and eggs worldwide that has made corn the world's leading grain. It used to be that the leading grains were wheat and rice because they were the food grains. Wheat and rice are the food grains for most of the world's people. But when people started moving up the food chain, what was needed then was corn to feed the cattle and the pigs and the livestock. So corn has now become the world's leading grain. We produce almost 1 billion tons of corn per year in the world. The combined production of wheat and rice is about 1.4 billion tons per year. So corn is the leading grain today. Um, and it's because of rising affluence and so many people moving up the food chain. Now on the supply side, we're beginning to run into some constraints on production. One is water. It takes water to produce food. Um, the It takes roughly 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of grain. So when we talk about the need for water, we're not talking about drinking water. We drink very little water, but we eat a huge amount of water when we consume grain, and particularly when we convert that grain then into meat, milk, and eggs. So if you were looking for a way to quickly reduce world demand for grain at the personal level, as an American, one of the best things you could do would be to move down the food chain and consume more vegetables and less animal protein. One region of the world where grain production is now falling because of falling water tables, because of water shortages, is the Arab Middle East. The four countries here, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, all depend heavily on underground water for irrigation. But the problem is that the demand for irrigation water in each of these countries has exceeded the sustainable yield of their aquifers. That is, underground water is being pumped faster than it recharges. The result is that irrigation wells start to go dry. And so these four countries today find themselves becoming more and more dependent on grain imports with each passing year because of their loss of irrigation water. Saudi Arabia is the leader in depleting its water supplies. The Saudis have announced that in 2016, irrigated agriculture in Saudi Arabia will come to an end. And if irrigated agriculture comes to an end in Saudi Arabia, agriculture comes to an end. So at that point, they will be totally dependent on imported grain to support their Canada-sized population of nearly 30 million people. Yemen's going to be in a very similar situation. So for the first time now, we're looking at a region of the world where grain production is falling and population is growing very fast. There's been no effort to integrate, to coordinate population policy and water policy. And so for the first time, we're going to see a head-on collision between population growth and falling water tables. If we look at this, at water use for food production worldwide, what stands out is the big three grain producers: India, China, and the United States. Now, in the United States, we do not depend very heavily on irrigated agriculture. The irrigated agriculture we do have is concentrated in California, and it's almost all for growing fruits and vegetables, mostly for U.S. consumption, but a substantial amount for export. So the only area where we produce grain with irrigated agriculture is in western Kansas and western Oklahoma, where we pump from the Ogallala aquifer. This aquifer is a fossil aquifer. That is, it does not recharge from precipitation, from rainfall. So when it is depleted, and it's already being depleted, and the irrigation wells are already going dry, but when it's totally depleted, there will be no irrigated agriculture in the western Great Plains of the United States. Now, that sounds rather threatening, but in fact, it's not all that threatening because most of our grain is produced in the Corn Belt. In that group of states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, um, and up into Minnesota and down into northern Missouri, that's the Corn Belt. And it is an extraordinary piece of agricultural real estate. Just to illustrate that, the state of Iowa produces more grain than Canada. That's a wow. And at the same time, it produces more soybeans than China. That's another wow. Because, I mean, we know that the Corn Belt is a productive area, but the Corn Belt is just an extraordinary piece of agricultural real estate. It is the principal reason why the U.S. is the world's only agricultural superpower today. That is, we produce a lot. China also produces a lot, but it doesn't produce enough, so it has to import um, grain and has to import most of its soybeans. But the United States is the leading producer and exporter of grain. So the U.S. is kind of a superpower, food superpower unto itself. Um, in India, or let me um, address China first. China um, depends heavily on irrigated agriculture. About 80% of their grain is produced on irrigated land. Most of their irrigation water, however, comes from two rivers, the Yangtze River and the Yellow River. It is surface water. But under the north, um, in the North China Plain, that's the one part of the country where they rely on underground water. And they are overpumping the aquifer under the North China Plain. As a result, wells are starting to go dry, and that's going to put a squeeze on China's overall grain production. But it's only a part of the grain harvest that's being affected by overpumping and aquifer depletion. India is a very different story. In India, um, there are now 26 million irrigation pumps. These pumps are lifting enormous amounts of water for irrigation each year. As a result, water tables are now falling in every state in India. And as they fall, um, wells start going dry. And so India has had a real run-up in grain production over the last several years because it has been overpumping. The World Bank estimates that 190 million people in India today are being being fed with grain produced by overpumping. My estimate for China is that 130 million Chinese are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. So we have this global water deficit now that at some point, when the aquifer is depleted and the wells start going dry, will translate into a food deficit. So that's one of the concerns that we face as we look ahead at the supply side of the world food equation. A second thing after water shortages is climate change. The rule of thumb is that it takes 1,000 tons of water to produce one ton of grain. Um, but the other important relationship is the relationship of temperature to grain yield. For each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, the rule of thumb is that, or the rule of thumb has been for some decades now, that grain yields will drop by 10%. temperature goes up by 1 degree Celsius, grain yields drop by 10%. A Stanford study, a very detailed study on 600 counties in the United States that was recently released, indicates that this is an underestimate of the effect of temperature on yields. They used data, this Stanford team used data from 600 U.S. counties. This really covered agriculture pretty well throughout the country. And they concluded that for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, that's 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, you can expect a 17% decline in grain yield. Now, in a world that's looking at the possibility of a 6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature during this century, this effect on grain yields is rather unsettling. We know that as temperature goes up, yields increase until temperature reaches 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, as temperature keeps rising from 68 degrees to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, there's no change in yield. But once temperature goes above 95 degrees, yield begins to decline. At 104 degrees, photosynthesis comes to a halt, and plants in effect go into thermal shock. They don't grow at all. They just try to survive. The stomata in the leaves tighten and close in order to reduce moisture loss as a sort of a plant survival technique. But when they do this, it reduces the amount of CO2 that's absorbed through these openings in the leaf. That is the basis for photosynthesis. So rising temperature is not good news for the world food prospect. Agriculture, as it exists today, has evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. So agriculture, as it exists today, is designed to maximize production with that climate system, the one of the last 11,000 years. But that system is now changing. And as it changes with each passing year, agriculture and the climate system will be more and more out of sync with each other. And that's going to take us into uncharted territory. We don't have any sound idea of exactly what that will translate into, but we know that it will lead to a decline in grain production or offset the increases in grain production from advancing technology. So we have water shortages, we have rising temperatures, and we have soil erosion. Soil erosion is not new. It goes back to the beginning of agriculture itself. But what is new is the scale of soil erosion in the world today. Up until the last decade or two, the sort of the reference point for dust bowls was the United States during the 1930s. During that period, the Dust Bowl in Kansas, Oklahoma, southwestern Colorado was developed and led to a decline in production. And in fact, U.S. farmers had to pull back in some of those areas and let that land go back to grassland because it was too dry to support agriculture. So we knew what was happening. We created the Soil Conservation Service in the 1930s in this country, and we were able to get the Dust Bowl under control. But today, there are two huge dust bowls developing. One is in western China, northern and western China. One of the reasons for this, in fact, the principal reason is not overplowing, though there is some of that. The principal reason is the enormous number of sheep and goats in China. Now, in terms of cattle, the U.S. and China being of comparable size geographically, in terms of cattle, each country has nearly 100 million head of cattle. The United States has 9 million sheep and goats. China has 282 million sheep and goats. And this is becoming a problem because this huge number of sheep and goats are simply devegetating much of western and northern China. And the government is not able to get control of this overgrazing situation because it would require villages, hundreds of thousands of them, to reduce the number of sheep and goats they have. And that would be politically impossible for the government to do. So this is a population on a collision course with a loss of topsoil through dust bowls and through wind erosion. So we have water shortages, we have climate change, we have soil erosion. We have a fourth factor, one that I call the glass ceiling. In many countries in the world, like like Japan, for example, where rice yields started rising more than a century ago, about 17 years ago, rice yields in Japan stopped rising and plateaued. They had reached the sort of the photosynthetic limit of what one could expect from rice yields. So however hard Japanese farmers might try, they can no longer raise the rice yields. They're just under 5 tons per hectare. Now, China's rice yields have been rising. The rise there started more recently, but they've been rising pretty fast in the last few decades. As a result, rice yields in China are now just 4% below those in Japan. So China is also getting very close to this glass ceiling in grain yields. So this is becoming a constraint on efforts to expand rice production in Japan and China, and also wheat yields in Europe. Countries like France, the United Kingdom, Germany have reached a plateau on yields and, um, and simply cannot increase anymore. It looks as though the yield of corn in the United States is also about to plateau. U.S. corn yields are the highest grain yields anywhere in the world, but I think they're about to plateau. So this number of countries like Japan and China with rice, the countries in Western Europe with wheat, the U.S. with corn, this plateauing of grain yields is making it more difficult to expand production. Now the question is, what do we do about this? Well, for one thing, I think one of the things we can do is to begin thinking about raising water productivity in the same way that from 1950 onward, we concentrated on raising grain land productivity, and we tripled grain yields. We haven't really focused on water productivity yet. We don't even have an indicator of water productivity. It's not part of our thinking, not part of our vocabulary. But I think we need to begin thinking about raising water productivity today in the same way we did about land productivity from 1950 on. A second thing we need to do is to think about grain reserves. We used to think that having a carryover stock of 70 days worth of world grain consumption, carryover stock is the amount of stock in the bin when the new harvest begins. So it's kind of the margin you have for making sure each year you make it to the next harvest. 70 days was traditionally considered an adequate level of stocks, but my own sense is that with climate change, we need to raise that 70 days to 110 days of carryover stocks. I think whatever was adequate before climate change began will not be adequate with climate change. So I think we have to raise our carryover stocks just to ensure our food security and safety in the years and decades ahead. The other thing we have to do is we have to cut carbon emissions because rising temperatures are a threat to food production and future food security. And I think everyone agrees we need to cut carbon emissions 80%, but most people are thinking about 1950. I think the game is going to be over long before 1950. I think we have to cut carbon emissions fast now. And the fortunate thing is we now have low-cost solar energy coming on the field. We have extraordinary wind farms coming on the field. China, for example, is planning to build 6 wind mega complexes, each of which will have at least 10,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That's equal to 10 nuclear power plants. The largest of those 6 will have, when it's completed, 38,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That will be equal to 38 nuclear power plants. That one huge wind complex, which is in Inner Mongolia, which is northern China, will produce enough grain to feed a country like Poland. So we're looking at something that we've not seen before. And the final thing we have to do is we need to stabilize population, and that means eradicating poverty. There are an estimated 100 million women in the world today who want to plan their families, but who do not have access to family planning services. Filling that gap, which would cost so little it would get lost in the rounding of our defense budget, filling that gap and enabling the 100 million women to plan their families would almost bring world population growth to a halt. So there is a simple sort of strategy for stabilizing world population, which is simply filling that family planning gap, and it really wouldn't cost that much. Mike, I think that covers most of the points I wanted to make, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Great. Thank you, Lester. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to encourage our audience to go ahead and submit their questions in the Q&A box. I know that we've had some people that have done that so far, and have also included a link to your slides, which
Mm-hmm.
are available on your website. Is that correct, Lester?
That's correct.
So I think we may be able to get that link posted somewhere on here before we conclude today.
Yeah, I
I
might
wanted.
just mention it is just earthpolicy.org.
Okay. All right. Wanted to get to some questions, and again, encourage the audience to submit theirs as well. Um, we had. I don't know if you've ever met Wes Jackson of the Land Institute, but we.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
I've
So.
known him for 40 years.
Oh, okay. I figured at some point your paths had probably crossed. Um, we had him on the Impact series last time, and
Uh-huh.
I I mentioned your name in a question that I asked him, and I want to ask you the same question to get your response to this.
Mhm.
Thanks to you, I learned about the depletion of the aquifers in the Middle East back when we had you on the first time, and I wanted to get your answer on this or your assessment. What effect does their dwindling water supply have on the global dynamics of both food supply and the distribution?
Well, the good news is that the number of people who live in the Arab Middle East, where the aquifers are depleted and where they're now so heavily dependent on imported grain, the total population of Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia is roughly 100 million. So in global terms, it's not huge. It's not like India or China or Pakistan or some of the more populated countries. So it is a factor, but it is not it has a negative influence on the world food supply demand balance, but it's not overwhelming. If India, which has uh, close to a fifth of the world's population, were to be in a situation where their grain production was declining because of water shortages, and they're not there yet, but it's going to come unless they make some major adjustments quickly. Then we'll see the effect on world food supply and on world food prices.
Okay. I had another question as well. Do you see the use of grain in ethanol dropping off any with the removal of the ethanol subsidies?
My sense is that one way or another, we're gradually going to drift away from the use of grain for ethanol. I think it's going to be, first of all, I think we're going to be moving away from liquid fuels and toward an electrified transport system. And the electricity, I think, is going to come from solar and wind. Um, but um, I think electric cars are the future, and high speed rail, which is also electrically powered. But we're going to see a big push with electric cars in the years immediately ahead. I mean, it's already beginning. Um, China, for example, well, in this country we have Tesla. In other countries, China um, will be introducing something like 12 new electric car models this year. So they're pulling out the stops, and I mean, one reason they're building these huge wind complexes is to get the electricity to run their cars with, because they know they can't keep using coal. That's creating serious health problems for them, and a potential political problem with severe air pollution. Um, and that's something that worries Beijing.
You mentioned China, and I did have a question about that. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Lester, but China had a long time population growth policy. Um, in your research, were you able to see an effect, either positive or negative, of that policy?
Well, when Mao was in power back in the 50s, 60s, that period, I mean, from the creation of modern China was in 1949. For the next couple of decades, his mantra was, we need more babies, more, under the communist philosophy he was operating under, more hands meant more labor and more production. So having large families and was the thing to do. But then somewhere around, I would say about the mid-70s, the Chinese began looking around and began asking themselves, what happens if we continue, expanding our population like this? And they realized it was not good news. That's when they they made a 180-degree turn and adopted the one-child family policy, which they really enforced rather strictly for a few decades. They've relaxed that a bit in recent years, but even after they've relaxed it, surprisingly, somewhat surprisingly, not many Chinese want to take advantage of the opportunity of having two children, or conceivably maybe in some situations three. Um, so the the Chinese government has been um, very forward-looking, and some would say inhumane, but I think they let their population get to a point where they didn't have that many options, so they had to start restricting family size to one for a while. I think that's relaxing a bit now.
Okay. We have a question from Leslie, and the question is, do you have information on how the process of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, how does that disrupt water tables and thus impacts the usable freshwater supplies?
Yeah, I'm not the world's leading authority on fracking, but from what I understand, uh, what the oil and gas companies are doing now is they're figuring out how to fracture literally layers of rock that that had natural gas and oil below them, but historically were considered to be out of bounds because it was so difficult to drill through these layers of rock. So what they've now done is figure out how to drill a hole, put explosives in it and a lot of chemicals, and set it off and fracture those layers of rock that were impenetrable before. So fracking is short for fracturing, and the concern is that one, it takes a lot of water. and at a time when water shortages are springing up all over the U.S. and indeed the world. Um, so it's bad news on that front because the oil and gas companies would be competing with farmers for irrigation water, for example. They can pay a lot more for water than farmers can. So in some situations, farmers have stopped farming and just sell their irrigation water for use in fracking. So it's bad news in terms of putting pressure on water supplies, in terms of polluting underground water supplies, and in Europe, for example, in most countries in Europe, they don't permit it at all for environmental reasons. And I'm sort of hoping that we will see the light before too long and abandon it in this country as well.
We have a couple of questions actually, and I really hope that I'm pronouncing this name right. If I don't, I very much apologize. Kamala Kanta. Um, the first question is, what are your views to try to sensitize the population about some of these large issues like energy crisis and some of these global problems in regards to food and water supply?
It's an educational challenge, and um, I mean, if we think back to 50 years ago, um, there there was no environmental movement um, because people weren't aware of any environmental problems, and the thing that broke that was um, the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And it pointed out what was happening to our water resources as a result of pollutants. It was about that time that there was so much oil on the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, oil floating on the surface, that it caught fire at one point, and the river was actually burning. And that was kind of a wake-up call as well. But a combination of Silent Spring and things and the discussion that followed from that, and things we saw happening with endangered species and with the Cuyahoga River catching fire and so forth, sort of got people thinking about the environmental problems we were creating for ourselves, and we had the emergence of the environmental movement. But up until then, I mean, there were some older environmental groups that went back to the beginning of the last century, but they were mostly looking at how to protect species from um, plant and animal species, but especially animal species from over harvesting and what have you. Um, but the environmental movement really came on the scene about 50 years ago.
I got a question from Matthew, and the question is, do you see a point where we might leverage, uh, we being, I guess, the U.S. here, uh, leverage our food producing ability in a similar way that the Middle East leveraged their oil producing abilities?
We certainly have that potential, and historically we have. I mean, at one time there was a very large U.S. food aid program, and I remember in 1965 when the monsoon failed in India, and they suddenly had to import like 12 million tons of wheat, and the most they'd ever imported before was 4 million tons. So they didn't even know how to get that much grain, from the grain elevators in Kansas to the villages in India. Um, but we did um, supply that wheat, but in exchange for it, we required that India reverse its food price policy um, from one that catered to urban consumers by putting a ceiling on grain prices. And we had them reverse that and put a floor price on grain prices, so that so that farmers would be encouraged to invest in improving their land and yield and expanding their production, either drilling irrigation wells or using fertilizer or whatever, or getting better seeds, whatever it took to expand production. So there is a chapter in history. In fact, there's a chapter in my autobiography that came out just a year ago called Breaking New Ground that's specifically on how we use leverage to restructure Indian agriculture and expand its wheat harvest um, by doubling it in 7 years. It was an extraordinary performance on the part of Indian farmers. So there is a history of using U.S. Uh, food exports for political purposes. And in this case, I think it was entirely warranted because the Indian government was not interested in agriculture. They wanted to industrialize. And even one of their officials had said, well, when a reporter asked him about grain reserves, he said, well, our grain reserves are in the grain elevators in Kansas, in effect saying the U.S. is going to be responsible for our food security. And President Johnson, LBJ, did not take kindly to that. He did not like the idea that India was putting the responsibility for their food security on the United States, and he made that clear. And that's when we tied um, food aid to agricultural reforms in India.
Gotcha. So this has been an issue for
So
a while.
yeah, so there we haven't used food for political purposes very often, but it is there, and there may have been times when the U.S. behind the scenes, when there's a situation brewing like the one in between the Arabs and Israelis right now, where the U.S. would have used food behind the scenes, but it would not have been a public matter.
Gotcha. I want to encourage our audience to keep sending in these great questions using that Q&A box. Sarah had a question. She wants to know, what can we do in our homes and lives to implement meaningful solutions that will address these food and agriculture issues?
Hmm. Well, um, one of the things we can do is try to figure out how we can live without a car, for example. Um, in this country, a car is almost part of our birthright, but and there are many places in the country, particularly rural communities, where you can't get by without a car. Um, but uh, that's an example. If you can substitute a car for a bike, what you do is you replace 3,000 pounds of steel and aluminum and glass and rubber with 30 pounds of steel and aluminum and rubber and so forth. So the 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 material it takes to make a car is 100 times that's required to make a bike. And then, of course, you have the fuel issue. Um, if you have a bike, you don't need oil. You don't need any source of energy other than what you eat. I remember calculating once many years ago. I think I figured I got on my bike about 7 miles per potato, um, which um, is actually a pretty efficient process. So that's one of the things we can do, shift from cars to bikes wherever it makes sense to do that. Another is to simply move down the food chain. Most of us in this country are living higher on the food chain than is healthy for us. That is, we're eating too many fat-rich livestock products, whether it's pork or eggs or hamburger or what have you. That's not to say we shouldn't eat any of those things, but we're probably eating quite a bit more than we need, and we would be healthier if we ate more vegetables and fruit and less meat, milk, and eggs. So those are the kinds of things that we can do. And I mentioned earlier the difference between living high on the food chain, like an American, and low, like an Indian. Is a difference of 4 to 1. So you can really make some very substantial savings at the personal level just by moving down the food chain.
I want to get back to a question that Kamala Kanta asked, because there were a couple questions submitted by Kamala Kanta. What is the potential of resource conservation if waste related to energy and food and water is reduced in some of these developed countries?
Well, there's a lot of potential there, and it's interesting to look at the energy requirements of recycling steel or aluminum or glass compared with the energy required to produce those things from virgin ore or virgin materials. Huge savings. So recycling has to be at the heart of a sustainable economy, and and this is probably most effective at the city level because that's cities are of the um, by their nature can address these much better than the national or state governments can. And San Francisco has become the first city in the United States and perhaps in the world to have zero waste. Nothing goes to the landfill in San Francisco. Everything is either recycled, the glass, the aluminum, the steel, or it goes to composting. But nothing is thrown away. And that, I think, is a model that can be adapted anywhere. It's just that San Francisco has taken it more seriously and worked at it and organized to do it. Could be done in probably any city in the world. And that would be exciting to have a no waste economy around the world.
Sarah asks, if we all grew some of our own food in our backyards or rooftop gardens, is that going to make any difference on a global scale, or is it, you know, uh, such a small percentage?
It will make a great difference on a global scale. Um, to begin with, um, many of us don't have access to land. I live in an apartment building in downtown Washington, which is 7 stories high. And uh, even if we used our rooftop for vegetable production, it wouldn't amount to that much. And if you have access to a plot of land someplace, it's good to use that to produce vegetables. It's good in the sense that you get fresh produce, and fresh produce is has a higher nutrient content than produce that's been shipped across the country or what have you. Um, and the other thing is it helps more people understand where food comes from and what it takes to produce food. And I'm thinking particularly of kids that grow up in the city today. Really, the food comes from the supermarket, and they really don't know much beyond that. They can't take it back to the farm and see how it's produced. And very few of us, a very small percentage of the U.S. population, had the experience that I did of growing up on a farm, which is an education into itself. But um, if you have a plot of land and then and can grow vegetables on it, you should do so. But we shouldn't expect that it will be more than probably 2% of the country's food supply.
Um, Kamala Kanta really wanted me to ask this question about carbon tax. Um, how how confident are you about the implementation of a carbon tax during the upcoming UN meeting in Paris, France next year? Do you see it happening? Do you see us kicking the can down the road again?
I'm I'm not very optimistic about, and I don't have a lot of confidence in internationally negotiated agreements in this field generally. They rarely yield anything meaningful, and if they do, they're not always implemented. Um, my own sense is that if we're going to make it, it's going to be because individual countries just go ahead and move out on their own and do it. I mean, in this country, um, I think the most exciting thing happening in the world today on the environmental front is in this country, and it is the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign. They started this in the beginning of 2010 And the purpose of that Beyond Coal campaign is to close coal plants in the United States. And so far, of the 530 coal plants we had when they made that announcement, 140 have been closed. There are 390 yet to go. But their goal is to close every one. And this wasn't, the Department of Energy doing this or um, um, any part of the U.S. government. It was an organization uh, that dedicated itself to doing this and has done it with surprising and encouraging success.
Lester, we are at the top of the hour. I didn't know if you had a couple extra minutes. We've still got some questions coming in from people um, about
Why,
topics we've discussed and also new topics as well. Is that
why don't
okay?
we why don't we say maybe two more questions?
Two more questions. All right.
Uh,
Um, so we've got one from Will, and it cuts off a little bit, so I apologize to not have the rest of the um, question, but I'm going to go with what I've got here. Uh, we were talking about leverage earlier, leveraging food supply
mhm.
and about India. Um, Will wants to know, was that leverage placed on India, was that the catalyst for the 26 million wells that were depleting the underground water? And given the vast reduction in carbon emissions coming from natural gas replacing petroleum product use, will the transition to electrical power be seriously delayed?
Let me take the first question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, with kind of two questions in the same thing there.
Yeah, um, the the policy that we worked with the Indian government on of providing not a ceiling price on food products, but a support price that would encourage farmers. Um, Among the things they did to expand production was to increase the irrigation. Um, Another was to use more fertilizer. Another was to get better, more productive seeds, higher yielding varieties. And um, that was associated with the, that was the beginning of, or at least it led to the acceleration of digging irrigation wells and is at least partly responsible for the 24 million irrigation wells. But in a sense, that's misleading because what is responsible for the need for those wells is the growth in India's population from, gosh, when I first lived in villages in India in 1956, they might have had 400 million people, and now they have 1.3 billion people. So they have had to greatly increase their food production, and that includes irrigation wells, fertilizer, the um, everything they could do to expand production.
All right, last question we have, and I apologize if we didn't get to your question. Um, I do very much appreciate everyone sending it in. Um, wanted to ask, what's your opinion on some of the major U.S. corporations? A couple come to mind, or McDonald's or Walmart, um, that are making a shift towards what's being called sustainable beef. Um, is is that move a drop in the bucket? Is their shift actually something substantial? Is there even such a thing as sustainable beef? I just kind of want to get your take on that.
Um, it's the word sustainable has become sort of a selling point, like organic. If it's organic, it must be good. If it's sustainable, it must be responsibly produced. Um, the reality is that um, McDonald's, which sells mostly beef, um, means that um, that beef consumes a lot of grain. And at some point, the demands in the world, whether from population growth or rising affluence, which moves us up the food chain, um, the combination of population growth and rising affluence are going to, at some point, if they continue, overwhelm the Earth's agricultural systems, and that's my concern. It's not whether McDonald's calls um, their hamburgers sustainable or not. It's how much, how far we can move up the food chain, and how many people we can add. That's that are the ultimate constraints we have to deal with.
Okay. Well, I wanted to take one more opportunity to thank our sponsors, which are Owens Corning and Green Builder Coalition. And I also wanted to thank the audience for joining us today, for their wonderful questions. Finally, I want to extend a huge thank you to Lester for taking the time to talk with us today and really highlight and feature uh, such a substantially important topic that I think really flies under the radar, and it's amazing that it does. But um, it's
Well, I
something.
wanted to, yeah, I want to say thanks for having me on today the second time, and I enjoyed it immensely.
Well, we hope that you'll all join us on September the 30th for the next edition of the Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. Our guest is going to be economist and social theorist Jeremy Rifkin. So we hope you'll join us for that. Look in your email inboxes for more information on that in the coming months. Thanks again for joining us. So long, and